Not too long ago, in 2008, the United States had a historic election. And I say it was historic because an African American man who only 4 years earlier had been virtually unknown on the national scene rose to prominence. I should say skyrocketed to prominence, and was elected president, Barack Obama, the 44th president of the U.S. And it was historic, of course, because he was the first African American to hold that position in the U.S. And it was also historic because it energized sectors of the voting population that had historically felt disenfranchised, disconnected, alienated from politics, from electoral politics. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about that tomorrow, Obama's election and how that impacted American electoral politics. But today, what I want to talk about is voting, voting rights, voter turnout, prior to that election. Okay, the right to vote. Now, originally, as you might know, the right to vote in the United States was in the hands of a small group of property-owning white men. So it wasn't even all white men. And the first step in the expansion of the right to vote went to white men without property. Now, it's been a long struggle for voting rights. It hasn't been giving the rights to everyone, it's been step by step. Sometimes a slow and painful step by step. After that, black men gained the right to vote. Finally, in 1920, black and white women gained the right to vote. So you can see it took hundreds. It took 200 years before everyone really had the right to vote in this country. And no step in the battle for voting rights has been easy. Because even after winning the right to vote, often actually voting was difficult because people were prevented from voting or prevented from registering, often by intimidation. So you would think that with such a long history of struggle to get voting rights, that we'd expect a high rate of voter turnout on election days. But the fact is that voter turnout has been at times remarkably low. Just to give you some examples, in presidential election years, let's see, the actual voter turnout, and this is just counting citizens of voting age, in 1992 was 68%. In 1996, it was 58%. In 2000, it was 59%. In 2004, it was 64%. I think this is pretty shocking because it indicates that more than 1/3 of the eligible voters in this country just haven't voted at times. And what I'm especially going to talk about is why this has been so. And that's the main reason for this talk. So what explanations have been given for this low voter turnout? Well, most people assume that the reason people don't vote is apathy. But this basically is not true. The main reasons not to vote are, well, there are two particular reasons. One are institutional reasons, and the other are political reasons. And we'll go into each one in particular. The institutional reasons have to do with the mechanism of voting, the procedures required to vote. For example, people forget to register in time. People might have moved and they didn't register again. Or they may think that registration is too time-consuming. Or they don't know how to get an absentee ballot and they can't get to the polls. So institutional reasons then are the reasons which are based on the mechanics of voting, the procedure required to vote, and the institutional reasons for not voting are the procedural problems that make it difficult to vote. Okay, so it's not easy enough to vote. Things like inconvenient hours for registration, early deadlines for registration, are primary reasons for lowering voter turnout. But in truth, these institutional reasons are not the main reasons. And far more important than the institutional blocks are political blocks to voting. For example, millions of Americans don't turn up at the polls because they feel that it's really not worth the trouble. For example, they feel that their real interest is not reflected in the system. They feel that the candidates don't reflect their interests. They feel that the candidates are the same. They don't believe that any candidate is honest. They mistrust politicians. You can see the difference between this and apathy. These people are not apathetic about politics, but rather they believe that politics is apathetic about them, that politics doesn't really meet their needs. Okay? It's not that they don't care, but they don't feel that politics is meeting their needs. So these are the two major blocks that prevent people from voting: the institutional and the political. Now let me tell you about a poll that was taken asking people why they didn't vote. Listen to this. In this poll, 38% of the respondents said they didn't vote because they didn't register. Now this could be an institutional reason, but it's really hard to tell from the statistic what the reason actually was. It could be apathy. It could be an institutional reason. It could be a political reason. We really can't tell. Now, 14% of the respondents gave explicitly political reasons. That is, they didn't like the candidate. They didn't think they were represented. They said they all seemed alike. Okay? 18% of the respondents gave explicitly institutional reasons, such as they were sick or disabled. They were new residents in the area. They were away from home. They couldn't leave their job. They had no way to get to the polls, etc. Okay. 10% of the respondents said that they were not interested in politics. So this is your apathetic group. They're simply not interested. Another 10% said they had no particular reason for not voting. They just didn't vote. So we might say that they're apathetic too, in a different way. Okay? And the remaining 10% of the respondents in the sample either were not U.S. citizens or gave some other reason. So it's not a great poll. It doesn't give you a lot of information, but it does give you some idea of the different reasons that cause people not to vote. Well, what are some characteristics of the voter versus the non-voter? Generally, we find that as education goes up, the likelihood to vote also goes up, and that's regardless of race or ethnicity. And you can see that at all levels. People who finished grammar school are more likely to vote than those who don't. High school graduates are more likely to vote than high school dropouts. College graduates go out more than high school graduates. They also find that those with higher income and higher status careers are more likely to vote than those with lower status jobs and lower income. Okay, another factor they found is generally the older you get, and that goes until about the age of 78. So the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. And exceptions to this are people over 78 who have a very poor voting record. Okay, so now they found that in terms of age, the range is from 24 to 78 is the best voting record. People below the age of 24 or above the age of 78 have pretty poor records. Now, what about race? Generally, whites go to the polls more frequently than blacks, who go more frequently than Hispanics, who go more frequently than Asians. Okay, what about sex? Women are more likely to vote than men. We've seen that regularly over the years. Okay, what kind of trends have we seen? Most times, what most analysts see is that the general trend has been that the poor, the uneducated, members of racial minorities have been seriously underrepresented in the voting booth. Now, has this been an accident? Again, most analysts don't think that this has been accidental, but they believe, or at least the author of your text believes, that this has been part of the larger political and psychological environment that has discouraged political activity by certain groups. So groups that do not have power in this country have not been encouraged to vote. They haven't been encouraged to be represented. And this goes back to some of the political reasons for not voting that we talked about in the beginning. So the picture has, at times, looked a little bleak, but it's really not as bad as it sounds. There are two things we might want to note about American electoral policy. The first one is that Americans conduct far more elections and far more types of elections than many other countries. So we're looking at this as a really bad situation, but when we realize that Americans vote 1 or 2 times a year, then maybe it's not that bad. So Americans vote far more, or they have far more elections than most countries. And also, the other thing is that Americans, in addition to having the right to vote, also have the right not to vote, which in many countries, people do not have that right, where people are afraid for their lives if they don't vote. Here we have the right both to vote and not to vote. So that makes the picture a little more optimistic. Even though, on the whole, I think it's pretty sad that so few people have in the past taken on the responsibility. Now, in terms of the future, there is reason to be optimistic. As I said before, 2008 was a landmark year with the election of Barack Obama, an African American, as president. There was a huge increase in general electoral interest, and in particular, an increase among young people and African Americans, groups whose turnout in the past has tended to be lower. So perhaps because of the increased incidence of women and ethnic minorities running for office, some of the disillusionment that a lot of minorities, a lot of under or unrepresented groups feel, may change. We'll certainly see what happens over the long term, and as I said at the beginning of the lecture, we'll talk about that more tomorrow.